UDP servers are actually very easy. We're going to see this in the code right away, but at least when we're writing Zig code, which I mean, that's probably why you're watching this video, you want to learn about UDP in Zig. It's not that much code. Create an IP address, bind a socket, wait for a message to come down, and then send a response back. And if you want to see something more complex, like TCP servers and REST APIs and CRUD APIs and all the things like that, I do have a video for that. So it should show up somewhere on the screen, one in the corners. If that's what you're interested in, go take a look. But if you do want to see the more like raw sockets, lower level stuff, like stay here, watch this video. I made it for specifically you guys. I know I've had some requests about it. Let's say you have a client and a server. Very simple stuff. And again, this is all in UDP. So a client will send some data to a server will respond. That's it. There's no back and forth handshake. There's no acknowledging, syntax, if you're in TCP land, none of that. It's just send and receive. If the data gets lost, it gets lost. If it gets corrupted, it gets corrupted. Let's just jump into it. You know, I think there's lots of videos out there for UDP. So if you want to learn more about how it works behind the scenes, go watch those. And if you're just here for some Zig code, let's get into it. Okay, and the first thing we're going to do is grab our IO interface, which is a nice part of Zig 0.16 is the fact we can just easily grab an IO instance right from init. And then we'll grab an address that we need to bind to. So I'll come from io.net.ip address, and then we'll parse just localhost. So if you've ever worked with any sort of server, you'll know that 127.0.0.1 is localhost, so just our local computer, and then we'll bind to port 8080, another pretty standard one to use. And now we actually need a socket. So earlier when we did our REST or CRUD APIs, we obviously used TCP so that we would bind the address to a TCP instance, but instead what we're going to do is to grab a socket. We're going to do address.bind. We'll need IO, but now mode is going to be, so we see we have different options here, but datagram or dgram, because we're using UDP, and that's the D. And then as always, we'll need to defer socket.close, passing in an IO. And now we can just have a nice debug print log. So UDP server listening on 127.0.0.1:8080. And now that's kind of all the prerequisite we need to do to actually start up a server or start a socket. And now we just kind of need that infinite loop of we're listening. So we need to start listening. So the first thing we need to do is be able to listen for requests, but we need to be able to put the request body or data into a buffer. So we'll create that buffer. And now all we're going to do is listen. So we come right here, we see message, let's try socket.receive. We'll need IO and then just a pointer to that buffer. And that's it. Now we are just listening for messages. It really is that easy. We're going to do just a simple debug print. We're going to print the data that we found. So message.data, and then just send a response. Socket.send IO message.from, so wherever we got it from, and we're just sending back the data. So this is a very simple, just kind of like a ping pong. All it does is it receives some data and it sends back the exact same data from where we got it. And we can see here that from is just an IP address itself. So it makes it very clear that where we're sending it to is another IP address. Okay, and if we come over to the makefile here, we see we just have a couple commands, one to run our server and the other one to send some data to the server, and we'll see what happens. So first, we're going to run our server. So we can see it's the listening on localhost, port 8080. And now if we do a make send, we can head over to our server and we see received hello UDP server. We can change this to be whatever we want from makefile. And we send it, and now we see hello from a makefile. So that's all that's happening. If we go back to our code, we see we're binding, or we're creating an IP address, we're binding it to a socket, and then we're listening on that socket, and just any message that comes in, we get the data, and then we send it back, or we'll print it, which is what we're seeing here. So this feels very simple to me. So I wanted to give something a little bit more interesting. So now we're going to transform this into more of a client server architecture. where we'll have a client and server. So in this case, this will be our server or something very similar, but then we'll actually write some Zig code to show how to interact with UDP, because all I've shown is how to create a UDP server. But what about a UDP client, where we actually want to be able to communicate properly with from a Zig code and don't have to have messy stuff like this in our makefile using NC, right? So now let's transition into that. Okay, so I made a few small changes. One, well, basically the server stays the same. I just added a little bit more data into our log here so we can kind of see what's happening a bit better. But then besides that, we see we now have this, instead of being one main.zig, we split it out. So main.zig became server.zig, and we have a new client.zig, which we're going to write. And then all that changed in our build is now we have two executables, one being a UDP server and the other being a UDP client. And we can see everything else is essentially just duplicate of the other stuff. In our makefile, we just have server and client. So if we look, UDP, the server will run the exact same thing as before, but then if we go into client, it's just going to fail to compile right now because unused function, we haven't filled it in. But we can see it's just going to be very easy for us to work between them. We will add a little bit more into our client because we want something to actually be a little more interesting rather than just sending and returning the data. So before we write our client, let's just finish our server implementation. There's going to be one small function. So it's going to be reply, which is going to take a message, which is a string, and respond with another string. Right? So what does this look like in practice? Well, we'll just call reply with message.data. Right? So now we can see it's going to receive from our client, right? So the incoming message will be from our client, which we'll see right away. We're just going to log what happens, and then we're going to reply based off the data we get. So let's just do a couple small checks. So a pretty famous one, if you ever try to do a Reddit clone, is ping pong. So if we receive ping, then let's just return pong, right? Another common one is echo. So starts with, this one's a little bit different, message, and starts with echo. Oh, fix that. Then we will return the message, but then 5 characters in advance because we're skipping echo and the space. And then finally, we'll just say try ping or echo message as a fallback. So now there's some actual logic that we'll see that the server can now process, in this case, commands. We'll say ping's a command, echo's a command, and then it'll respond accordingly to those commands. So what does a client look like? Well, it's actually going to look kind of similar. So let's just head back over to server for a second, and we'll grab IO, and let's just say an address for now. So we know where our server is. So this is our server address, which is what we want to call, right? But now our client needs to have its own socket open to be able to communicate. So we'll have something very similar, but instead we're going to say client address, and this one will just be 0.0.0.0, which for us, our sakes, is just going to be pretty useless. We're not going to be interacting with it, but rather it's a temporary client that we're going to use. And now socket equals, this is again exactly like we saw before, and bind IO and dot mode equals dot, should be dot mode dgram. There we go. And then defer as before, socket dot close IO. Okay, and the way I want this client to work is we're just going to type commands on our CLI or in the terminal, and then it's going to send those to our server, and then we'll get the response back right in our terminal. So that's kind of what I want here. And let's set that up. So we'll need an stdin buffer of u8s, standard buffer, and then we'll need a standard in reader, stdio file, so stdin. And let me know if you guys do want a video on the new IO interface. I think I had talked about it in the past, but I want to know if people will find it actually useful, and then maybe I can go over things like how do you even just like read from standard in and things like that. So please let me know, drop a comment if you think that's useful, and let's keep going. So now let's just have a little helper message, type a message, or let's just say quit. There we go. And now let's have our infinite loop. So we'll just kind of provide something that makes it a little bit easier for us, makes it clear like where we're typing. And now let's read line. So I see in reader interface take delimiter. Oh, sorry about that. Sometimes IntelliSense gets a little messy, especially when we're this zoomed in. It doesn't look that bad if we're zoomed out, but I do try and zoom in for you guys. So yeah. Okay, so we get the line, or else we'll break if there was nothing. Now a request buffer. So this is similar to what we saw over in our server, because it'll be, again, essentially the same thing. And now request equals if scmem equal u8 line ping, then we will return that line. Else we'll say try std fmt buff print, because remember it needs to be prepended with echo. So request buffer. And now I hope this makes sense. I'll go over it right now. So we're saying the request. So what's the body? Like this request is saying the request body in reality. So if it starts with ping, or if it is ping, no, I shouldn't say starts with, if it equals ping, then we just want the request equal the line, right? Whatever we type, if we type ping, we just want to send ping. But if we typed a message, we don't actually want to type echo at the start. We could have made it like that, but it'll automatically prepend echo for us and then send over the message. So now it's going to be as simple as socket.send IO to the server address. So that's the key part, server address. So we're sending it to the server, and then that's the request. Okay. And now we'll get, we need to be able to get a response back to see what the server said. So we'll make a response buffer, and then response equals try. So this is exactly like we have on the server. Receive. Come on, there we go. IO, and then the response buffer, and then we'll just print it. Debug print. So the server said whatever it had said. Response.data. And that's it. So let's just zoom out a little bit here so we can see it more holistically. So we have our setup. We need a server address and a client address so we know where we're calling or binding locally. And then so we create a socket, and we need the socket to be able to call out and actually receive data and call in, let's say this case, and when we send, we're sending it to the server. So we need our own socket to work with and able to make these requests. And then this is set up for standard in reader. And then all this is processing our input that we type, and we'll see that right away. Then we send that to the server and we get a response back. And now let's try and run it. So we'll make our server. And now we have a UDP server listening. And now let's see what happens when we do make client. Okay, we see we got address in use, and that's because we bound these both to port 8080. So just, again, this is more like almost like a void that we're treating it as. So let's try and do this one more time. Okay, there we go. So type a message or quit, and this is still listening. And then let's just start with ping. Server said pong, and then we see we receive 4 bytes from this, and it received ping. So we'll try that a couple more times. There we go. So that's pretty cool, right? So if we go back to our server, we see we had typed ping and it responded with pong. So what happens if we type hi YouTube? It responded hi YouTube. See, it echoed. And also notice how this last one, because I did ping, but with then a space, it responded ping because it's, and then if we do without the space, it responds pong. My challenge for you guys is take what you learned from this client server, and take what you learned with the REST API or the CRUD API video and try and combine it so that you have the CRUD API server, but then a client TCP server. So then you're, or like HTTP server, so you're sending HTTP requests in Zig code to the CRUD API. And if you guys want to see that video, please also drop a comment, let me know. I can make a follow-up video to the CRUD API where we make a client in Zig and we call our API in Zig instead of a makefile. Which, now think about that, I think that'd be a great video. So please let me know if you want to see it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I thought this was actually, wasn't going to be that exciting when I first got into it, but then I really tried to make the examples as concise and consolidated as possible to try and show off the power of Zig in a way too, being like how little code it actually was to make the initial server, right? It's so easy to just start processing data from UDP server, and all it takes is an IP address and a port. So I hope you found this useful and it's a good reference guide. If you did think it was helpful, useful, make sure to give a thumbs up, subscribe, leave a comment, and let me know what you guys think. All those things really help the channel, really help me grow. And if you want to come chat, there's Discord link down in the description. And besides that, just have a great day.